Well, thank you, Lindsay, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And well, happy birthday again to ECHA, and congratulations for your achievements so far. I want to begin by just stressing how important REACH and the work done by ECHA in relation to REACH is to the NGO community. It goes really to the heart of an issue that Europeans care about, which is the presence of chemicals, toxic chemicals in the environment, in air, water, and food, of course, but also in products. I think I really like the remarks made by Cefic on a couple of points, former Cefic and present Cefic. That's not always to be taken for granted when you have environmental NGOs and Cefic in the same forum. I really like the connection you made with this being a European success project, because I think that dimension is sometimes forgotten. And when we are in the middle of a very intense debate about the future of Europe, what direction should Europe go in? What should Europe do more of? What should Europe do less of? And it's been, let's face it, a kind of a crisis with one of the old member states in the process of leaving. I think it's very important to acknowledge that environment is something that Europeans want the EU to do more on. And this is confirmed by successive Eurobarometer polls. 3 out of 4 at the last poll in March, Europeans want the EU to do more on the environment. And I believe that's also true in the case of chemicals. And I think I also want to acknowledge the achievements so far. And that's the second point where I agree with Cefic. I think starting off with the role of REACH as a kind of global standard setter. Just now, Sauri was elaborating on the range of countries who directly through different agreements are being influenced by REACH. So I think there's a hugely important role being played there. It's brought groundbreaking new principles such as no data, no market, substitution, building on the precautionary principle, and the reverse of the burden of proof, putting the burden of proof for the safety of chemicals onto companies, and so on and so on. So I think there's quite a lot of half glass, half full stuff that we can focus on, and I don't want to be kind of churlish and avoid that, because this is, after all, a birthday celebration, and I think there is quite a lot to celebrate. However, and of course there is a big however, there is a lot more that can be done and that must be done. The pace and the manner of the implementation of REACH and its further development to meet today's challenges leaves a lot to be desired. And I appreciate the honesty of the ECHA spokespersons today and Geert in acknowledging that. And of course, this is not only ECHA's responsibility, it's the responsibility of member states, the Commission, the business sector. They also share responsibility for addressing the very real problems that we've had, this slow pace of rollout of REACH. And I want to mention just a few examples. Firstly, in the area of registration, the very poor quality of many of the dossiers that have been submitted, and in fact the lack of a comprehensive system for actually knowing how bad the situation is, that we have no full information on the number of non-compliant dossiers, but the indications are bad. The percentage of non-compliant registration dossiers has remained well over 50% for the last 5 years, and I think many of you will be familiar with a German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment study from 2015, which showed that only 1 dossier out of 1,814 was compliant with standard information for all endpoints. And I think as long as ECHA has been providing registration numbers and therefore access to the market to all registration dossiers by default, even when these are incomplete or inadequate or irrelevant, the principle of no data, no market is not being applied, nor is the burden of proof being shifted to industry. On the contrary, inadequate dossiers are having to be completed by member state authorities. to fill in the information that's missing. And therefore, we welcome the fact that ECHA has now started to revoke some dossiers. I think it's a small number, 3 at the moment, if I'm not mistaken, but this is something we believe should be significantly stepped up. We also believe that a name and shame approach should be taken, and we find the reticence of ECHA to do this is overcautious, but we also understand that it's because ECHA believes that there wouldn't be support in the wider REACH community for a name and shame approach, and that's why over the heads of ECHA I would like to speak to member states representatives, industry representatives here, to appeal to you to say a name and shame approach. Why should you defend those industries who are failing to submit responsibly completed registration applications? The second area I want to mention is authorization, and well, the same paper that Daniel, by the way, an excellent half glass, half full description, Daniel. I mean, I couldn't fault you on that, but of course there's the other half of the glass, and the 2001 white paper that you referred to also estimated that 1,400 substances had hazardous properties giving rise to very high concern. And yet the fact is that today the candidate list only includes 173, and the authorization list itself only 31 chemicals. So we really have a long way to go, and we really need to speed up that process. Also, even when substances are being put forward for inclusion in the authorization list, we don't believe that the precautionary principle is being applied effectively or correctly when the decisions are being taken, or in the preparation of those decisions by ECHA and its committees. These have been granted too much by default, even when alternatives are clearly available, as is the case with the decision on lead chromate-based paints, which is now the subject of legal challenge and is likely to be the subject, and similar decisions of further legal challenges. Well, it was nice to hear that the statistics on litigation, from your point of view, good, Sharon. But I mean, litigation, of course, should be the last resort, and we would also be happy with less litigation. But I think there could be other reasons behind that. But we simply shouldn't have to be litigating on an issue like this. It should be too obvious that this was a bad decision. And we would prefer to see less litigation and better decisions. But if we don't get good decisions, we will, of course, be very keen to see member states litigate, and sometimes to litigate ourselves. Well, once something's already on the authorization list, then there's the issue of compliance with the obligations to notify the presence of substances of very high concern in articles. And by the end of 2016, ECHA had received in total only 368 notifications from companies regarding the use of substances of high concern in articles. And we suspect that this is a very tiny proportion of the articles containing these substances that are marketed each year. So I think there's an issue there. And then finally, I see I'm stretching my time a bit. I can't finish without mentioning the issue of transparency. This is absolutely fundamental, but I must say that we are less satisfied with where we've got to on this. First of all, I do want to give credit to ECHA for the very good work they've done on dissemination and making the availability of this information on substances and their properties available. This is excellent. However, the right to know also has other dimensions, and the important information in chemical safety reports, for example, the name and shame issue that I mentioned earlier. There are other areas where we feel that ECHA is being too cautious and too worried about offending the business community. And I would just remind that the obligation to give to protect business confidentiality is not an absolute one. It has to be balanced against the right of the public to know about factors that affect environment and health. So thank you very much. I'll stop at that.
Thank you. Well, first, I just want to say how honored and humbled I am to come to speak with all of you on your 10th anniversary. Honored because of the high esteem with which ECHA is held around the world. Humbled because of just how far ahead ECHA and Europe is than the United States in chemical safety management. I also wanted to express the utmost admiration, Geert, I have for you and your staff for what you've been able to do for the last 10 years as someone who's held similar positions in the United States associated with chemical safety. The idea of getting an operation as complicated off the ground with the speed with which you did that, with legislation as complicated as it is, with as many challenging issues, the complexity of your stakeholder community, and as a U.S. citizen, I'm always astounded at how you operate within this government structure you have here, known as the European Union. It's all rather breathtaking what you've been able to do in 10 years. So my congratulations to you and to your entire staff. It's quite a remarkable achievement. As it relates to my observations as a former chemical regulator from the United States, I see extraordinary amounts of opportunities within the two systems collaborating and working together. There hadn't been a huge amount of collaboration in the space, largely because the U.S., as many of you know, until just last year, did not have a particularly robust regulatory structure for the regulation of industrial or commercial chemicals. That changed with the passage of the Toxic Substance Control Act reform of it's almost a year now, in the United States, a small miracle given the political environment in our country. But we have that, and it's a rather robust statute. The U.S. comes at it from a different regulatory structure way than REACH does. But what is at the core of it is what is at the core of REACH, which is data assessment and risk management that flows from the data that you're evaluating. And so when I talk to stakeholders about these vast differences between the two regulatory structures, I think in general they're missing the underlying foundational elements of the two approaches that fundamentally rely on assessment for evaluating chemicals for safety. And if our governments can focus on that common element, I think that they will see there's extraordinary opportunities for working together. And the point of working together at the first level is so that we can each do our jobs better, so that we can make better decisions associated with chemical safety, so that we can evaluate more chemicals more quickly. That is why, in my view, you collaborate across governments on issues like this, and you might even get some level of harmonization at the end. You might. That, to me, however, is a secondary benefit. The data that's been generated for purposes of REACH is an extraordinary resource that if we can effectively tap it, which we have not been able to do yet, but if we can effectively tap that, can inform decisions not only in Europe but in the United States. I recognize some of the data quality issues that you're struggling with, but as you begin to address them, they'll be in time for the U.S. to take advantage of that. We began before the recent TSCA law passed in the United States, actually trying to do what we knew Congress was doing administratively. We were trying to do that before the law passed. And so we did a number of assessments before the law passed. There were 5 of them. They're all in the public domain right now. 2 of them relied on ECHA assessments that we basically made our decisions based on risk assessments that you had done here. We were continuously asking ourselves what data is available through Europe, what assessments have been done, can we use them, how can they inform our decisions. Over time, I only see that increasing. As I said a bit ago, there's definitely this challenge related to access to the underlying data as opposed to the robust study summaries. We're somewhat suspicious, although I'll bet you'd get a little different answer if you asked someone in the current administration, related to robust study summaries. But I think over time, we're going to see our governments needing to have access to the underlying data as independent authorities often come to different conclusions than are coming out of the robust study summaries. But I think we are both aware of that issue, and if there's an interest in collaborating on the underlying basis for decisions that are made by ECHA and the underlying decisions that are going to be made in the United States, I think there's an extraordinary opportunity working together. I think some of the work that we've already done as it relates to computational toxicology and computational exposure also offers an amazing opportunity for our countries, both in terms of the speed with which we can get our arms around chemical safety, as well as the desire in parts of both countries. It's even begun to, it enters into the U.S. legislation of reducing animal testing. So I see a lot of opportunity going forward between our countries. And even though I'm not an official in the United States, I don't think that you will see, when you're talking to my former colleagues, that they will come at it from a fundamentally different way than the way that I have just described it. Bjorn, you next.
Well, thanks a lot. My name is Bjorn Hansen. I work in the European Commission, DG Environment for Danielle here. I would love to actually spend my limited time simply congratulating one-on-one all the speakers of today. I've picked up messages. If it's Sharon's, we've done great, but let's do better. If it was Sauri's words on Europe, if it was Geert's vision on where we are going to go with ECHA, if it's Danielle's 3 things that we've achieved, and I can go on. But I'll try to put a few pennies of my own thoughts into this and say something which hasn't been said before, which is a bit difficult. But I think if I start with the vision of where are we going and where is ECHA actually going? Well, where are we going? The next decade will be very turbulent politically. We've mentioned Brexit. We've mentioned future of Europe, 2025, the various directions that Europe can go. But within this conglomerate of uncertainties, which, by the way, I think have been there every single decade of Europe's existence over the last many, many years, there are 2 certainties, I think. And those are the 2 certainties that will bring ECHA forward, and I think will show that the first 10 years of ECHA were the first 10 years of ECHA, and the first 10 years which will set a long path of maybe 100 years, if we can follow what the Prime Minister said. And the one element is that our well-being as European citizens is largely dependent on chemicals. I think CEFIC on their website now says that chemicals industry is the enabling industry of all industries. And that is ever so true. Everything that we do as a consumer, that we do in the workplace, is dependent on the functionality of chemicals. On the other hand, exactly those chemicals also have an impact on that exact same well-being. And that issue, it's absolutely necessary to have chemicals, and on the other hand, chemicals have an impact on our well-being. That's the certainty that will continue. And that's why ECHA's role is completely certain for the decade to come, despite of all the uncertainties that will be there in the decade there. Now, which opportunities lay ahead? Well, I'd like to split it in 2, within the EU and internationally. And I think I can definitely agree with Jim that where he gave some examples of internationally, ECHA and the Union, but ECHA in particular has enormous opportunities. But that is mirrored of what ECHA can do internal to the EU. Rather than use Geert's words, which I would have loved to do, but they're on video, they're on film, so I can't repeat them. Let me start from a different angle. What are we doing in the Commission already in order to use the competence, use the knowledge, use the staff experience of ECHA in order to help us implement other pieces of legislation? Well, we ask ECHA about shale gas. We ask ECHA about fluorinated compounds. We ask ECHA about potential new substances which could harm the ozone layer. We ask ECHA about, could you not make a few occupational exposure limit values for us, because we trust and think that you can do this right since you're doing the work anyway. Those are actions that we're doing right now, and I think are completely indicative of where the Commission wants to go. And I think it follows very much in the direction of what Geert says, that what makes logical sense is that if you have 600 people implementing chemicals legislation in one place in Helsinki, and when one of those pieces of legislation is REACH, which fills the gaps between 120 pieces of legislation, then inherently you know 120 pieces of legislation. So why not, step by step, eventually go all the way and do one-stop shop of chemicals management, of chemicals implementation in one place. This was Bjorn speaking, observing what the Commission has been doing. On the international agenda, I think we're actually further. One step back to explain. We have circular economy, communication. We have the idea of getting into circularity and a discussion both on a plastic strategy and the bigger scale of a chemical waste product interface, which effectively is all about how do we get molecules to remain in a circle, no matter whether that molecule is in a use phase or in a waste phase, because the molecule doesn't care, and we want to recover it. In the bigger picture of things, what we keep doing is Europe is pushing a chemicals and waste agenda. Whenever chemicals was there mentioned, it now is chemicals and waste. And that's Europe pushing it, and that's the direction that we're going with circular economy, but more broadly internationally. And if you look at UNEA 2 and the resolutions at UNEA 2, re-emphasizing and re-strengthening the SDGs, which already have chemicals and waste as a central theme, then you see that that's the direction that we're going internationally. And if I could finally say that what Danielle said about the early 2000 WSSD 2020 goal, well, if you look at Europe's negotiating position going into the SDGs and what actually came out of the SDGs, well, then Europe got its will once again. And that's our soft policy, and I think that that's where Sauri's message is on what is Europe, how does Europe work, and how can we make the world a better place? Well, that is exactly with that model. We get the SDGs, we get the world to accept our values, we politically support it, and we then have an agency which can help us. And an agency of 600 people with the competences that are here clearly is one of the mass machines of capacity building for the future if we manage to get into place a framework following up on SciCam. If we get into a beyond 2020 chemical and waste framework, then clearly the competence and the abilities of this agency is right there to be harvested. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Peter's not speaking out because Sauri spoke, so we gagged Peter momentarily, but my first question is for him. So, listening as objectively as I possibly could, being an ECHA staff member, one of the big criticisms made most eloquently by Jeremy, but also by Geert, was about data quality. It's your companies that are responsible for that data quality. Peter, what have you got to say about that, and what are you going to do about it?
Thank you. Well,
welcome.
Welcome to ECHA. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, Lindsay, for the question. Perhaps predictable. On the other hand, I don't want to be the person who pours cold water on proceedings, was a quote I may have heard earlier. Well, quite a lot, really. It's a topic that's very close to our hearts. What I can say about the way we view it inside CEFIC, because that's trying to bring a link to a time that I didn't know in CEFIC. I've only been here the last few years. But the importance of ensuring that compliance is something that we maintain is critically important. So within the CEFIC world, that means people like Sauri, who is presented here today as the Vice President in CEFIC, sits on a board in CEFIC, and we put in front of them any of these questions around compliance. Compliance in itself never comes up as a discussion point. So in terms of the importance that we attach to it, that's something we do. Step one, when you think where we are, because I'm going backwards a bit now, I guess, but if you think where we are, we've got through the first 2 of the registration deadlines, and we come up to the third one. That was an enormous undertaking from the point of view of simply getting a job done. I think what we're moving to now, pivotally, is this question around, well, was the job fit for purpose in absolute? So one thing is to get the job done, another is to get it as good as you can, or at least ensure that it's fit for purpose. And with regards to that, I would say that we've learned at the different stages so far, and we'll learn again after 2018 on what we can do. And we try to put in place things that enable the companies to do the right thing. I know when I first arrived, I was post the first deadline, and there was a lot of discussion around the concept of intermediates. Now, I won't bore you with the details of intermediates or not, but I do know that with the help of ECHA, and this is always collaborative, we got at dossiers we thought were probably wrongly described as intermediates, and to the best of my knowledge, they were either upgraded to substances, which is a different level of data quality, or they were perhaps withdrawn or whatever. But the reality is that I don't get so much details on the intermediates. I mention it only as Gert leaves because that may come back actually in 2018, and I'm not saying that in a negative sense. I'm just saying as we get very many smaller companies coming in for the first time, their interpretation of what an intermediate is, and I say I won't bore you with those details, may still be a little different from what we've grown accustomed to, so we're going to have to make sure that goes as smoothly as possible. If I move to the next deadline, areas that I think we can help with in particular is something that was, again, I hate the jargon for it, but the Chemical Safety Report Exposure Scenario roadmap, which has been extended from, I think, starting around 2016, about 2013 through to 2017, and it'll go on to 2020. Those are a series of tools that will look at how we can ensure that the data inside the dossiers properly reflect the uses, and with the uses, the right exposure, and that we've got the right data. Now, that's work in progress from the second one. What we do in terms of CEFIC itself is that, interestingly enough, some people in industry and perhaps elsewhere thought that REACH will be finished in 2018. And if you've already got through the high volume substances, it is finished. The reality is it isn't, and what we've done, and I hope that ECHA can attest to this, is we've maintained the people close to ECHA, close to the member states in the committee, fully aware of what's going on, keeping up to date with developments, so that continually flows back through our own working teams to companies. So in that sense, we don't just look at these milestones as saying we come to an end. We recognize this is a journey we go on together. We've intervened where we can. It's not always easy because of multiple priorities. I think we'll continue to do so. And that's the way we'll progress forwards, at least in terms of dealing with quality matters.
Okay, so if I understood you right, you're saying that from your perspective, things will improve as people gain in experience and understanding of what's required, and that the kind of more collaborative endeavours that there have been between ECHA and industry have, in your view, paid off?
Well, I think it's an ongoing process, and as I've said, to some extent, we were getting through deadlines in the registration. The pivotal moment is that I think as we come towards the 2018 deadline, what REACH will focus on are those other elements in the acronym REACH, less on the registration, except for the quality, but more on the evaluation and assessments that go on, and, as we've already mentioned, authorization and these processes about perhaps prohibiting some substances. And I think there'll be a shift in focus in terms of what the companies are doing and what they will continue to do. But for us, it's a continuous process. I understood the record has some good text against it, in the sense that we've done an awful lot of work, covered a lot of substances, created a database, which Jim seems to think would be quite valuable in the future. So it's good to hear from an external eye. But there's more work to be done, as was stated by others.
Okay,
and we
thanks.
continue to support
anyone else like to add anything on that issue of data quality? Yeah, Bjorn, please.
I could add a couple of reflections that we're having. I mean, we're having the privilege of being able to sit back and reflect whilst ECHA does the work and try to write it up in a REACH evaluation on what we believe. And I think from my perspective, the storyline that the data quality is poor is an observation, but it oversimplifies maybe some underlying mechanisms, and it also doesn't quite do just to all the efforts done. So I would like, if I can spend 2 minutes saying a few words on what one also can read into this conclusion. I mean, one is obviously it was a huge effort for ECHA, for industry to produce all these export files and send them to ECHA. It was a huge effort for ECHA, its staff to get the database set up. And by the way, it's a huge effort of ECHA staff to use the data on absolutely great ways that they're doing at the moment. But if you look at it, industry has actually made, in technical speak, Annex 11 derogation statement. So they have actually filled in information for all the data requirements. It's just that information doesn't seem like it's coming up to par, or it's serving up to par. Now, one can say that that's a lack of effort from industry, where industry should have done a lot better, and industry has said, yes, they could have done a lot better. They were under time pressure. There was a problem with the economic crisis and all of this. But you can also see on top of it that REACH actually requests industry to do their absolute total utmost not to do a test. And if you have a requirement as industry to do your utmost possible not to do a test, you will try to maybe push it a bit more than you would in a scientific paper, your read across or your grouping approach or your QSAR. So in REACH, there really is already a driver for industry to push it to the limit, and purposely so. This was part of the OZOR thinking back then, was that clearly let's push industry as far as it can, and then ECHA will pull industry back. And that's a healthy battle. It's a healthy discussion between the two parties. So that's just as an explanation that it's maybe not as bad intention, but is a bit actually predictable and inherent in the system. That doesn't take away from the fact that obviously there is an issue that we need to get more compliant data, and without more compliant data, we can't be sure that we meet the WSSD 2020 goal, which luckily is recycled in the SDG 12.4, so we can also postpone it to 2030 and achieve it there. But clearly, there is an issue that we have to address.
Okay. Jeremy, briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I already spoke about this at some length, so I won't say much. But I think, you know, in any regulatory system, if non-compliance has no consequences, then you are implicitly encouraging non-compliance. And this isn't really to be, I mean, it's just, I was going to say it's human nature. I mean, I could also say it's company nature. But, you know, whatever group of entities are being asked to comply, you're going to get some who simply don't, unless there are some consequences of non-compliance. And that's where we think ECHA needs to look again at this issue of name and shame. The only answer we've heard of that is it could penalise the lead companies who are taking the lead for a group of companies. But I mean, I think you could, you know, if you for the next round, if you notify people, put people on notice up front, this is going to happen, then of course there'll be more sense. Well, we better take this a bit more seriously. Whereas if they know that there's very little chance that anything is ever going to happen, then I think you're in a way encouraging non-compliance, and implicitly you're penalising the ones who are doing it right, which is exactly the opposite of what the message we should be sending.
Okay, thank you. I just want to check if there's a question in the room, because if not, I will ask another one. Yes, there is a question. Please tell us who you are and go ahead and ask your question. Yes, it'll come.
Thank you. My name is Steve George. I'm chair of the Aerospace and Defence Industries of Europe REACH Working Group. And for some of the people in this room, a right royal pain in the backside at times. For the last 7.5 years, I think downstream industries such as my own have become a little bit more aware of REACH. And it's probably fair to say we've recognised how important it is to us. As we look at things like circular economy and resource efficiency, is it possible we can look again at how we look at the stakeholder relationships and perhaps the way supply chain expertise is represented in member state committees and ECHA committees, these sort of things, to look at the whole picture of the whole supply chain? It is natural that chemicals engages the chemical industry and metals industry first, absolutely right. But as we now understand a little bit more, perhaps we should look at the stakeholder mapping again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. An interesting question with a different perspective on the engagement of downstream user stakeholders. Anyone got any perspective on that? How is it done in the US, Jim?
It's an interesting dynamic in the U.S., and it wasn't because the government was acting, it was because the government wasn't acting, that a lot of the political pressure that ultimately came to bear that led to the reform of the law came from the downstream. The consumer-facing companies were finding that since the government wasn't acting, they had to act, and so a term that we began using, private sector regulation, retailers began regulating upstream what chemicals they did not want in products. And so we had a fair amount of, as the law was built out through the congressional process, there was a fair amount of engagement because it was being driven by the downstream users reacting to their customers.
I mean, what I can add, sitting in Brussels and trying to get authorization decisions adopted by our REACH committee, obviously for us, on every single one of them, they present a challenge in terms of what are downstream users really doing? What alternatives do they really have? What alternatives do they actually see? And that picture is for us somewhat unclear with our current stakeholder involvement through our formal meetings. This doesn't mean that we haven't done outreach to try to speak. I mean, I wouldn't qualify you in the way that you just said, but we do have regular dialogues, and I think we do within the Commission. It's an obligation, and I'm sure ECHA does the same, reassess whether we have the correct balance. But clearly, as REACH moves away from registration and more towards restriction authorization, not that we're going to be necessarily doing more of it, but that'll be a bigger share of the work done on REACH, then obviously the downstream user perspective has a relatively higher weight and should be reassessed regularly.
Yeah, I think it's actually an excellent question. Thanks very much for that one. A couple of things I can speak about within the industry. Again, things I've inherited, but I value quite a lot, is we set up quite early what we call our REACH cross-industry platform. And aerospace, I'm sure, is a member there. But it sits around a couple of times a year. I guess it could sit there more times to try to ensure that what we see coming ahead in terms of REACH is getting further down the chain. That's one thing. The other thing I'd point out is that back to the transparency, that's one of the values in ECHA, and which is, I think, a very important aspect, is that we've tried to get more and more as a collective. Now that means the member states as well as ECHA and the Commission on what is coming up, because predictability is very important, obviously, down the supply chain. And we know more and more that there's this risk analysis done up front, which is getting a little bit of hope at what Bjorn's saying. And I think that there you really do need some very early input from the downstream user. So that's right at the very beginning of saying, well, what are we going to do with this substance? I think ECHA sometimes uses the phrase substances that matter. In other words, out of all the substances, which should we set the priority on? And a good deal of that decision reflects whether or not you know how and where it is used, to Bjorn's point. And therefore, I'm not sure of the governance and the mechanism of where we should have stakeholders, but we should certainly have input increasingly from downstream users. And within CEFIC, and linking a little bit into the work Saori mentioned on ICCA, that's an area that we're trying to do more and more work at as it fits into things such as the complex supply chains. It's very unlikely, for example, that a car that's made in Europe is made only from European components. So the supply chain is already global. Chemicals in their nature are global, and the benefits we're trying to achieve in the safety areas, not just the benefits functionally, but the benefits for environment and humans are global effects as well. So again, that's an area that we're trying to do more of, again, basing as much as we can on what we know of REACH and we know what's coming, understanding value chains internationally as well as within the single market here in Europe. And I can only say that I think it's a very important point. I'm not sure I know the best way to engage. I think that's probably not for the panel here just to come up with how ECHA should do it, but I think the need to engage with the downstream user has never been more important.
Okay. Thanks very much, Peter. I'm going to draw this to a close now. It feels quite